Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I get off the train and deliver a podcast to you on my way home. I'm Brendan Riley. Today on Pick Up and Deliver, I'm going to talk about learning games. Not learning games, although I thought that would be interesting to talk about games that somehow learn from you. That's a podcast for another day. But learning games. In other words, learning how to play games and developing as a gamer. So today is February 15th. Happy day after Valentine's Day. This will probably come out sometime next week. It is a foggy morning here in suburban Chicago. I am recording this on a day when I don't actually go into work, so my introduction was a lie. You've now learned some of the magic of podcasting is that on a day when I feel like recording one of these, but I am not necessarily walking home from the train, I might just take a walk around my neighborhood and record one. But Brendan, you say, why not just record in your house where it sounds nice? Well, one, I'm not getting the exercise that I need. And two, that's not the shtick of this podcast, right? Part of the idea of this is that I'm not working from a script other than maybe a couple of notes in my little creativity notebook. And I'm walking. And I think it changes the flow of the podcast, changes the feel of it. You get the cool background sounds of, I guess, suburban Chicago. And there it is. It's very foggy this morning. Temperatures in the high 20s, low 30s, so it's pretty comfortable. I'm not wearing gloves. I've got a hat on and my cool Alaska Sea Life jacket from Seward, Alaska. But it is foggy. I can only see about a block and a half before everything fades into mist like a first half of the 2000s video game. Anyway, so today I want to talk about learning games. So I thought I would hit a couple points. First, I'll hit a couple of different ways people learn games, including what I do when I'm learning a game. And then talk a little bit about some of the deeper nuances of how to learn games. So to begin with, I'm keen to hear how you learn games. What are your primary ways to learn? And I think there are two kinds of game learners. The first kind is the person who learns from somebody else. And we are all that person some of the time, for sure. But if you're the game collector in your group or one of the game collectors in your group, there's a good chance that you're the one who buys new games or brings new games, and you're the one who's teaching them a lot of the time. So if you're that person, you're the one who's bringing the new game, then you need to learn the game in a different way than all the people who are learning the game from you. So I would say one of the classes of game learners is people who learn from other players. And I'm going to say this is the bulk. I was trying to think about the math. This is the bulk of people who learn games, are learning them from other players. So I want to start a little bit with a good way, how to be a good learner when you're learning from someone else. Step one is pay attention. I know that seems silly, but there are a lot of people who don't know how to pay attention, or they don't demonstrate that they pay attention. And those are related, but not entirely overlapping things. So the how to pay attention is just listen to the person who's talking. Try not to let yourself get distracted by other things. Ask questions if they come up. Be engaged. And it's a nice thing for the person doing the teaching if you're demonstrating that engagement by maintaining eye contact, following along as they do things, and generally don't have your phone out. Now, I have friends, one friend in particular, who's very good at learning games without appearing as though they are learning games. So sometimes they will have their phone out and it appears like they're not paying attention at all. They might ask a question or two that shows they didn't hear everything we said, but then they routinely do very well at the game. So they show they were listening on some level when we get to play. And I've learned with that person just to not pay attention or not care that they appear to not be paying attention, because I know they are, in fact, are. That said, as a game teacher, it can be very frustrating if it appears that you have someone at your table who's not paying attention, because you just know that person is going to cause trouble later by not knowing how to play. So that's step one, is how to be a good learner. But really, this conversation is not for people learning games from other people. I mean, there's only so much control you can do in how you learn a game from somebody else. What I want to talk about is when you know ahead of time that you're going to learn a game, What are things you can do or should do in order to learn them? So the most basic method for learning a game would be to read the rule book from the box. And I would say this is one of the most difficult ways to learn a game. In part because writing rule books is super hard. I know as somebody who's been doing it, you write a rule book, you think it makes sense, you read it, you realize you left stuff out, you rewrite it. By the time you get to version 8 or 9, then you show it to somebody else, and they point all the places where you left things out or doesn't make sense. Pretty soon you got a 50-page document that explains everything but is entirely unreadable. So then you start editing. Maybe by the time you get to version 12, then you could show it to a player who's going to try to learn the game from it, and they will miss everything, and you have to start over. It's a brutal, complicated process to write a rule book for a game with any kind of complexity at all. And learning a game from a rule book can be very difficult. Sometimes a well-written rule book is a dream to learn from. There are an awful lot of games that are just really hard to learn the games from the rule book. I think on another day I will do facets of rule books that I really like, but not today. You know, I said there are also how to play videos. These exist in a variety of formats. My personal favorite, I like the playthrough videos. In particular, I've mentioned Rado Runs Through before. Richard Ham, or Rado as he's known on YouTube, does a series of videos called Rado Runs Through, where he plays the game and kind of explains it while he plays it. Now, I really like his videos because it gives you a sense of how to play the game, but he often misses small rules or messes up the math occasionally, and he's got a guy who watches the videos and then puts in comments indicating where the rules mistakes were made, which is excellent, I think. But I wouldn't want to just watch Rado's video and then try to teach the game, because there's a decent chance that either he never got to a particular rule or I didn't understand it, and they also tend to be kind of long. I mean, his introduction to how to play this game videos are usually about a half an hour, and then he'll usually do an extended playthrough video for another half hour to an hour, and then he'll do final thoughts. And you could watch that entire, sometimes 2 hours of content and never really fully grasp the game because you didn't get the rules. There are also truncated rules videos. Sometimes there are videos that'll say, like, learn how to play X game in 5 minutes. Usually these kinds of rules videos are okay, but generally I reserve them for if I know that someone is going to be teaching the game anyway. I will watch one of these short videos as a way to get myself prepared for the things they're going to be telling me. If I have a broad architecture of how the game works, then when I get into the specifics with somebody, I already understand the basic flow of the turns and that sort of thing. Finally, you have the comprehensive rules videos, something like those on the, I would say the AAA premier channel for this kind of content is Watch It Played, produced by Rodney Smith. These videos are exceptionally well done, exceptionally thorough, and crazy long and kind of boring. As much as I like Rodney, I think he's great. I watch these videos at 1.5 or sometimes 2 speed because he speaks really slowly, which is important, but they're just really dull. That said, they're very thorough. So when you watch one, by the time you get done, you know how to play the game really well. And unlike being taught in person, if you don't understand something, you can just back up and watch it again and not annoy the person doing the teaching. Rodney's always happy to back up and explain it again. Plus, from a personal perspective, he's from northern eastern Canada, and his accent is delightful. In particular, the way he says card, he says cared. Put a cared down, and I love it. So hats off to Rodney. Those are a great way to learn videos or learn games. Now, again, it's one thing to learn a game so that you can play it. If you're going to meet up with other people who all know how to play already, then you're learning it from the perspective of playing. But often, for me, most of the time that I'm learning a game, I'm not just learning it for the perspective of playing it, I'm learning also to teach it. Usually I am the one bringing a new game to a group. Often that group is my wife and my daughter, sometimes a couple of our other friends. Sometimes it's a group of people at my gaming group, which is Toggle Gaming. I go to every other Tuesday in Palatine, Illinois. at the bar Dirty Nelly's. Join us. And in that case, then not only do I need to be able to understand how the game works and understand the rules, I need to understand them well enough to explain them and be able to answer questions. So it's an entirely different level of involvement or skill to teach a game of this caliber than it is to play a game of this caliber, I think. So a couple things that I try to do when I'm getting ready to teach a game of this depth. So the first thing that I do usually is watch one of the short videos, something like those learn to play a game in 5 minutes. The Games Rules Girl gives a good video that's usually in the 5 to 15 minute range, and this will give me an overview of how the game works. Then I read the rule book. I try to read the rule book cover to cover. I try to read it thoroughly, asking myself questions as I play, making sure I can kind of conceive in my mind how to play. Then, if there's one available, I will watch a playthrough video where people actually play the game and I can see them play it. Finally, I will think about, and if it's a complicated game, probably rehearse how I'm going to teach the game. Ideally, if I know who I'm playing with, like if I'm bringing a complicated game to Toggle, like for instance, this week I played Concordia for the first time, and another guy from the group was bringing it, but we arranged ahead of time that we were all going to meet at 7 o'clock to play Concordia. And so he, since I knew that I was going to be playing it, I watched a video of how to play it before we played it, as did other people. So when he explained it relatively quickly because we all kind of knew what we were doing ahead of time. And I like to do this with any game I'm playing. If I know ahead of time the people that I'm playing with, I will send them a video and say, here's a video of how to play. The downside to doing that is that you're asking your players to do some work ahead of time. And some people just won't ever do that. So then what happens is you get there and half of your players really understand the game pretty well and could do with a 5 to 10 minute explanation. But the other half haven't looked at anything yet and they need the full explanation. The nice thing about that happening, when that happens though, is that when you're doing the full explanation, the people who watch the videos can help. And I found that actually works really well because I'll get to my personal flaws in a minute. There are many, but I'll get to my personal flaws about teaching games in a minute. But one of the challenges is when your players who are at the table are bringing different levels of experience to the game. So the last thing that I would do, and this, I really am only going to do this if it's an event game. So an event game is one where you plan your whole gaming experience around it. In our family, event games are most often new chapters of time stories. When we get a new chapter of time stories in, or rather my friend who buys them does, then we will arrange for a day when we know we're going to play time stories. We don't have to do any rules prep because time stories is the same rule set each game, or you don't know what the difference is until you open it up and start playing. But if we're going to play a new game that's kind of that caliber, like I played Twilight Imperium 3 for the first time over the summer, and when I played that, we all prepared ahead of time. We all watched the games. The idea being that we'd get together and not need to do rules prep. But for your average complicated game night, where people maybe know what they're going to play ahead of time, but I generally am not going to rehearse, mostly because I don't have time to do that. Ideally, I'll have played it once before I bring it to a big group, but often that's not the case either. My more complicated games don't get play in my smaller groups, so the only way that I'm going to get to play them is to bring them to the big group. But if you can, it's really good to practice the patter. I also would offer a couple other pieces of advice, and I am totally cribbing here from my favorite video about this, which I would recommend you go watch, from the group at Shut Up and Sit Down. They have a really good video about how to teach games, and there's a couple pieces of advice that I've found from that video to be very effective for me. I will also say a lot of my rules about teaching games come from Richard Ham as well, Rado, because I think he does a pretty great job of explaining games. So from Rado, the one piece of advice that I like most is explaining things in terms of theme. That most of the games I play have a theme, either implied or directly stated, about why you're doing everything you're doing. And for me, learning a game, but also teaching a game, explaining why the game does something in the context of the theme helps the players grasp and retain the information of why they might want to do that. So explaining things in terms of theme is a good one for me. Second is give the players something to do. This comes from the Shut Up and Sit Down that he suggests when you're playing. The first thing you do, before you've even really started explaining things, is give people their player board, give them their starting money, give them their tokens, because often listening to people talk, it's nice to have a secondary outlet of something to do. So people will then stack their cubes, or like when we were playing Ex Libris the other night, as I was explaining the game, all three of the players who were learning from me were stacking their little meeples. And I didn't consider this a distraction. I could tell they were still listening, but sometimes it's nice just to have something to fidget with. The third thing is, when you are explaining actions, it's a good idea to have people actually do the action while you're explaining it, and take turns doing that. So say, Bertha, you put this piece on, and then Chris, you take her piece by doing that, and Dave, you now play this card. And by doing those things, then you're getting them involved, but you're also helping them have a sense memory of how that action occurs. The first thing I always explain is theme. What's the general idea of the game? And that leads into the second thing, which is perhaps the most important thing you should explain, which is how you win. It's always a real bummer if somebody doesn't explain what you're trying to do to win, or they don't explain it very well. I played a game of Zolkin once, and the person who was teaching it did a great job teaching us all the things that could happen, but didn't do a very good job of teaching why we would want to do any of the things that can happen. And that made it really difficult to understand what you were trying to do to win. I mean, he explained the win condition, but he didn't really explain how the things we were doing led to the win condition. And as a result, the two of us who'd never played before did very poorly. Or because we're bad at the game. Either one. So after you've explained the win condition, it's really good to explain the tiebreakers. That's important. There was one game I played where I thought I understood the tiebreakers, and I didn't explain them, and it turned out that an essential part of the tiebreakers was something I had not explained, and so it actually messed up the end of the game, which isn't fun. And then, sort of walk the people through a round or through a turn, telling them what options are available to them. And I generally, for a complicated game, I will tell everybody up front, this is a learning game. We're going to be relatively flexible with takebacks, and I'm not going to explain every single rule at the beginning. Because some of the more complicated games, something like a Feast for Odin, I mean, you could spend an hour explaining the game before you even start. And that's no one's going to enjoy that game then, because by the time you start, you're tired. So for a game like that, I will call it a learning game. We'll get started, and I'll give enough ideas that people can get started, and then say, like, for instance, if you want to do the hunting action uses these cards, and you get stuff. When you're ready to do the hunting action, I'll explain how it works. That would be maybe how I would do a Feast for Odin thing. The last thing that I would offer is that it's really important as you're explaining games to think about where the nuances are, and where they are obvious or not obvious. Because I've had problems before explaining games where I'll forget to mention some nuance of the game, and then when it comes up, I remember it, but at this point now, people have been playing without knowing that rule is there. Easy example would be Barren Park. I feel embarrassed to say that I've taught Barren Park several times, and I've taught it wrong a couple of those times. The reason I'm embarrassed is that Barren Park has like 3 rules. One of the rules, however, is that whenever you place a new tile, it has to be touching one of the previous tiles you placed. For some reason, when I teach that game, about half the time I forget to mention that rule until the first time someone tries to place a tile not connected. And I'm like, oh, no, it's got to be connected. Well, I feel really stupid. There's only 3 rules. I ought to have explained all 3. So that's the thing to be aware of if it's something you do particularly as I do. be aware of how how not being careful might result in an unpleasant game experience for the people learning. Finally, regarding questions. If someone asks a question during the game setup, it's generally a good idea to explain it right away. Now, if the question involves so much explanation that you might as well have started the next section of the game, you could say, we'll get to that in a moment. But most of the time, it's easier just to answer the question right off the bat, especially if it's something kind of nitpicky. Even if you were going to explain it later, if you ask it when they're thinking of it, it'll help them remember it better. Now, sometimes you'll run into rules clarifications issues, things where you don't quite know how to resolve an issue about the rules. Having the rule book handy and being familiar with it enough to look it up quickly is great. Also, having somebody have their phone at the ready to check on Board Game Geek. Often, if you Google a question with a kind of specificity that's useful, you will find that Board Game Geek will have the answer for you pretty quickly. Or someone has asked the question already if it's a game that's been out a while. So that's really useful as well. Well, hopefully this gives some insight into learning games and teaching games. I'd like to hear what tips you have or what advice you've found effective. So let me know. I'm on Twitter at RattleboxGames, or you can email me at brendan@rattleboxgames. Well, thanks for joining me on the walk this morning. I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.